Thank you so much. So we've spent 2 days together learning all the ins and outs of what's going to happen at General Conference. So we're going to wrap up our news briefing today by taking a little bit of time to talk about how to equip you to tell the story of General Conference to the church and to the world. For those of you who are delegates, you'll set the future direction of the United Methodist Church. So this is your story to tell. And I want to invite you to bring alive take that experience of meeting together with United Methodists from around the globe to pray, to worship, to confer, make decisions together, and bring that alive for other people. For the annual conference communicators, you, of course, also have a responsibility for bringing that experience to life. And when delegates and communicators work together in partnership, then everyone's job is easier. So we've put together this amazing panel of communicators and delegates. They are practiced at working together as a team in order to tell the story of General Conference. And so our goal today is that you will come away with something, a new idea, a fresh perspective, a different or better strategy that will help you to meet that challenge. We're going to talk about how to work together in partnership as communicators and delegates. We're going to talk about what to do if you're contacted by the news media. We're going to talk a little bit about how to make this experience relevant for local churches, and we'll have some do's and don'ts. So, and as we get started, after we have get into it for a little bit, then we'll take questions from the audience. But I want to just jump in and introduce my panel. So from the North Georgia Conference, we have communicator and delegate. We have Sybil Davidson, who's the Director of Communications, and she has covered 4 general conferences. And the Reverend Dr. Byron Thomas, who is the pastor of Ben Hill United Methodist Church and the chair of the delegation for the North Georgia Conference. From East Ohio, we have Rick Wolcott, who is Director of Communications. I believe he's covered 3 general conferences. And along with him, the Reverend Andy Call, who is pastor of Church of the Savior United Methodist Church, and I believe he's a second-time delegate to General Conference. And yes, I have an odd number of panelists on the stage, and that's because Paul Black, who's on the end, is from the Illinois Great Rivers Conference, and he is both the conference communications director and the chair of the delegation and a veteran delegate to General Conference, so he's going to bring us that unique perspective. All right, so let's jump in. I'm going to start with my friends from North Georgia here. So why is this partnership between a communicator and a delegate so important, and how do you get started on that?
I would say that we start the moment the delegation's elected. We start by sharing who was elected at our annual conference. Almost immediately, Byron shared that he liked to fast on Thursdays through General Conference, and that kind of thing is really important to just from the start working together. And the reason is because there is so much work on the delegation that I'd like to take the communication piece and make that an easier piece from them so that they can tell their story without having it be a burden.
So how about you, Reverend Thomas? When you're in the thick of things at General Conference, does it help you to know that you already have a relationship where you've worked together and you sort of know what to expect from each other and how to depend on one another to tell that story?
Yeah, I think that the working relationship is critical, but I also think that it's important to say that I have a great deal of respect for her, not only as a communications expert, but she is a person who loves the church. And so I always am comforted by the fact that I know I'm working with a person who has the best interest of the church in mind, in addition to having the skill sets that's needed to get their message out. And we always talk about it because, again, she's a subject matter expert, and so I rely on her capacity to perhaps see things that I may not see and therefore be able to communicate them in a way that she's familiar with that is best.
Sort about, let's ask our friends from East Ohio, like how do you get started working together? Does it need to be a face-to-face meeting? Do you meet with the whole delegation? How do you get started?
Well, I think it's important that you have a plan. General Conference changes constantly, and this year will really change quickly. So you really need to have a plan going into it. And I also think that it's important, there's a lot of different perspectives from General Conference. The communicator has one perspective, but the delegates have a totally different perspective. So it's important that the delegation and the director of communications or a communicator have conversation ahead of time. So I meet with the delegation at one of their meetings, talk about what's important as far as communicating and how it's important that their voice is heard. And then proceed from there with, making sure I have contact information, cell phone numbers, and then, I text the delegation every day, here's a question to consider for the day, and, I would like responses from as many of you as possible so that I can share the thoughts of our delegation, both clergy and laity, throughout the General Conference. Yes.
I think it would also be a lot harder to do this if we didn't already have a relationship established in our annual conference. So Rick is great as a partner across the conference because we have continuous communication. I mean, as you can imagine, there have been a number of times there have been media inquiries, and we have an open line of communication. Rick usually lets us know. He does a great job of making sure that we know what's going on, but we all also know that we can reach out to Rick with any questions about that. So going into General Conference, we're not trying to establish a relationship with our conference communications director. We already have a strong relationship there, and that level of trust really aids the communication piece of that.
So, Paul, you have both kind of an advantage and a challenge. So, obviously, you know what's going on in the delegation, and that helps your partnership, I'm sure, but you also have these responsibilities that you have to fulfill. Talk a little bit about how that helps, or maybe does it make your job more difficult?
I think overall it really hasn't had a major effect one way or the other. The Illinois Great Rivers Conference is very good at delegating, and so when it comes to communications, I'm usually designated as the spokesman for the delegation when I'm on the delegation. Now in 2016, I did not attend, and I also wasn't a part of the delegation. Our conference was hosting the jurisdiction, and so I chose not to even offer myself for election. And that was a little more of a challenge than being a part of the delegation. But I think the other key piece is to realize you have two channels of communication, internal and external. There is a message that you have to fashion and a communications to your conference, to your churches, and then there's also a channel for the external press. And there are inquiries that come from both channels. How you fashion those messages may be very different. And I think that, one of the things, your communicator is a resource that's available to you that can help with that mediation of message so that it has the best possible chance to not only be placed and you have your story to tell, but it also allows for a positive outcome, and it provides a single point of contact too.
So let me ask the communicators on my panel, what makes it so important for you to have that delegate perspective and able to enable you to fully tell the story of General Conference and make that relatable to your congregations?
I think it's that the delegates that were elected from our annual conferences are the face of the global church those 2 weeks to the people back home. And we want to hear their story because we know them. We want to hear their story because they know how what's happening at General Conference impacts us in our annual conference.
Well, I think perspective matters. Perspective matters too. So we each have our own perspective, and it's important that we share that. And I think sometimes what's communicated from a conference level is interpreted and received differently than something that's communicated from a delegate. And I think it's important that we have that balance in how we report what takes place at General Conference and what takes place in the ministries of our churches on a daily basis. We all have a perspective to share, and this is just amplified more because it's on a global stage.
I think it's also important to remember the value of relationships, especially with external media. None of the delegates have an ongoing relationship with the external media piece. But as communicators, we may very well have that. And if we do our work in advance of General Conference, one of the things that I think has been a real teaching moment in the last couple weeks as we've seen different stories appear in national media, one thing is for certain: they do not understand our polity. They don't understand the system. They don't understand process. And as a result, that is one area where your communicator can help in advance, being proactive, because you're not going to have the time during those 10 days at General Conference to educate a reporter on everything possible with United Methodists. And so doing some of that early work and relying on your communicator, particularly on the external piece, I think is important. The other thing I try to advise when it comes to delegates, it's almost, several of you may understand crisis communication. In a lot of ways, General Conference is crisis communication, because it is a situation that is a highly emotional, highly tense type activity. And so realistically, I encourage our delegation each day, what are the 2 or 3 messages you want to come out of on behalf of the delegation today? You can't possibly cover the vast scope of whatever thing happened today and have each individual delegate going every which way. The message gets lost in the confusion. But if you have 2 or 3 salient messages that you can give as being from the delegation, then work to find the people who can support those messages or gives perspective that actually fits that. You're much more effective in staying on message.
Let me ask my delegates, have you found that folks in local churches are interested in that perspective that you bring as a delegate, that they kind of want to hear what that's actually like, and what's been your experience with that?
Good, Byron.
Yeah, there are individuals in our local churches who are absolutely interested, but there are also individuals who could care less. Those who are interested we've had listening sessions, and they actually come out and they have an opportunity to express what their concerns are. And in those listening sessions, our job as the delegates are simply to listen and provide no comment. And so there are various levels of interest on behalf of those in the local churches.
I've been serving in the United Methodist Church in employment for over 20 years, but only for the last 8 years in clergy. And so I was elected as a lay delegate in 2012 in Tampa. And a few people in my congregation said, "Are you going to update us on what's going on? Tell us about what's going on at General Conference. We want to know." And so I started a blog, and I didn't know a thing about what I was doing with the blog, to be honest. I just started sharing stories, thinking that 4 or 5 or maybe half dozen people were paying attention. Sometime in the middle of week 2, I became aware of how many people were following, and I was utterly astonished that there were over 350 people following that blog. It's probably a good thing I didn't know that at the time, because I would have shifted the way I presented it. And I think one of the things that, for me, that has been helpful in that, and what I've learned from people is, as a delegate, people aren't looking to me to provide the news updates or the blow-by-blow of what's happening. That's the work that Heather and Sam and Kathy and other people do, and if I tried to do that job, I wouldn't do it anywhere near as well. But what people are interested in is, what does it feel like to be a delegate? What are the emotions that you're going through? What's actually happening? What's the atmosphere on the floor of General Conference? And those are perspectives that I think I think people are genuinely interested in, well, those who are interested, Byron, I think that's, but that has been really interesting to me to discover how many people are really care about what's the human interest side of that, and what does it feel like to be there, and what are you wrestling with, and what are you hoping are going to be the outcomes?
So that brings up another good topic, which is the channels of communication that you use. So for you, it's a blog. For some people, it may be video. It might be social media. It might be email. What's really let's kind of go down and see what is kind of your go-to, your big channel that you do. Is it email, social, web, blog, video? What is it?
I would say in North Georgia, our major communication piece back to the churches is a daily e-newsletter that gets shared also on social media and on the website, but that's our main piece back, which may include video and photos.
Yeah, in addition to that, and speaking to the whole notion that there are internal and external communication audiences, for the internal communication, Base Camp was set up by one of the delegates, Phil Schroeder, and that's a major way that we communicate. However, restrictions are put in place as to who can post anything to the Base Camp.
We create a general conference mini website within our conference website, and I think it's important. We haven't talked about this yet, but Andy had mentioned about the work that Heather and Sam and Kathy do. I use United Methodist Communications as to tell the story of the day of what's happening. They're tuned into it. They're in all the meetings. They know what's going on. And so from my perspective, I want people from East Ohio to know how East Ohio is being impacted by what's taking place. So I'll use the resources that United Methodist Communications puts together as far as the daily update. And then the stories that we tell in East Ohio are about the delegates themselves or pages or marshals or whatnot. But everything goes to that landing page. And then we share through Facebook and through Twitter, and with each social media post, we link back to that landing page so that you can go and see today's news, but you can also catch up on what's been taking place leading up to today.
I've given a couple of snapshot images to our congregation, also using Facebook Live, just videoing myself, which has taken some getting used to, I will admit. I have long arms, that does help, but trying to catch myself and something else in the background, in terms of kind of the pastoral message to my congregation now, I think that has been really helpful for people to see my face, not just to read words. And typically the attention span tends to be pretty short, so I think there are people who want to follow that blog, but there are other people in the congregation at least who need that sort of pastoral message because they're reading some of these stories and they're picking things up in the national media who don't understand what's going on, and they want to know, is everything going to be okay? Or not, and so that's been another nice direct link.
It varies from general conference to general conference what tools are used, because you're also dealing with the talents of your delegation and what they feel comfortable with and what they don't. In 2012, which I believe was the first year we had open Wi-Fi on the floor, I had planned to at least use Twitter, and I found very quickly that my message couldn't get through to my audience because of everything. And the Twitter feed at General Conference, my opinion, is nothing but a bunch of noise. Mm-hmm. And my people were not seeing that. And so I employed Facebook. We have a Facebook group of about 2,000 people. And so I would start a thread when we would convene in plenary, and I said, post your questions. And most of them were watching the feed, but the feed does not provide any context as to what's going on. And so I would have to tell them, we're considering petition this is what it's about, proponents support it for this reason, those that oppose it on these particular things. And I carried on an ongoing conversation in Tampa with our folks. And in fact, I believe it was in Tampa that the Board of Pensions was making a presentation. Our conference treasurer back home had a question. And so he typed it in. He said, I'd like to know the answer to this. I raised my hand. They called and recognized me. I went and read straight off of my phone his question, and he got it answered. So I thought that was pretty good service. But we also use blogs. We have a blogging platform that's part of our website. And in 2016, we had several people who had their own personal blogs, and I gained permission to also be able to repost those on a single delegation blogging, and it allowed for the expression of the human side of things. But it varies from general conference to general conference based on what circumstance you run into.
Can I also and Andy, thank you for bringing the pastoral side of it up, because the reality of it is that our approaching the 2020 General Conference, there's been a lot of anxiety over a long period of time. And so with respect to my congregation, I'm not constantly feeding them this information because there's been so much uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And in order to care for them, and caring for them looks like helping to keep, hopefully, the anxiety down, because it's not just the anxiety around the uncertainty of the 2020 General Conference going back. It's also taking place within the context of national anxiety. And so I keep that in mind in terms of the information that we give. So it's periodic updates, but not always having information there.
I'd like to know what my audience thinks. How do you like to get your general conference updates? How many of you like to get them via social media? Just raise your hands. How many of you had rather get them via email? Some email fans. Who would rather watch video than read? Who likes a little bit of all of them? Yes, so there we go. All right, so they're all good, right? Rick, I think you mentioned having a plan being important. Mm-hmm. And so how do you get started on that plan, and what's on your checklist? What needs to be a part of your plan?
Well, there's really a couple of things that go into it. One is a plan for how you're going to cover, and the other is a plan for what you're going to take with you, and how you're going to care for yourself, because that's the other issue that we all face. Whether you're a lay delegate, a clergy delegate, whether you're a communicator, a staff agency, it's that self-care. So there needs to be a plan, and it's been alluded to by a few other people over the last 2 days. A plan for making sure you stay hydrated, and that you get your steps in, and that you most importantly get your sleep, and so that's one plan. And then the other plan is making sure you have communication with your delegates and with your staff back home about what you're going to communicate, when you're going to communicate it, how you're going to do it. If you're fortunate enough to be able to bring somebody with you from a communication standpoint, so you're not a one-man band, that's a plus. I know not everybody has that opportunity. But for people who are communicators who only are able to bring themselves, it's important to know that we in the communications field are a network of people. We're a connectional church. We're also connectional communicators. So if you're here by yourself or coming to Minneapolis by yourself, by all means, reach out to one of the communicators in the room here today, or reach out to us before General Conference, and let's talk about how we can partner and help one another out. There's limited numbers of passes to get photos on the floor, but if you know somebody who's going to be on the floor, a quick text to be able to say, hey, can you get this picture or whatnot. So that's all part of the plan. It's not just what I need or what my delegation needs, but it's what do we need to be able to tell the story as a church to our congregations, but also to the secular world. And
so for my delegates with these competing responsibilities, you've obviously recognize the importance of communication and of sharing. How do you perhaps, do you have any tips for how you make time to do that, or how do you prioritize that when you've got other things that you may have to go to committee meetings or other things?
There's a wonderful, wonderful person by the name of Jean Brown, who is my administrative assistant. And she helps me with a very busy schedule, and she understands the shift that I've had to make with respect to my responsibilities as a member of the delegation and the head of the delegation. And so we have talked, and we've talked about priorities, and she has helped, as well as my staff, to take some of the responsibilities in the local church as I've continued to try and live into my responsibilities as a delegate.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I'm glad my wife isn't here to hear me answer that question, because she would laugh when any suggestion of any kind of healthy work-life balance. In terms of the advanced preparation, what we're doing now, I think that's always a challenge, because and I have a very supportive SPRC who understand that, and we're blessed with some other, not only my appointed clergy associate, but then some other clergy who are kind of assisting with some of the other responsibilities that pastorate brings. In terms of on-site, I have found that if I'm going to write that blog, I almost need to just stay at the table at the time that we recess at the end of the day, because if I think I'm going to hang on to that and then later in the evening go back to the hotel room and do that, it's not going to happen. And sometimes it's early morning, kind of getting some of that, and writing kind of as the day goes, not waiting to summarize everything, taking notes, but writing in time. It's not a foolproof plan. I mean, each day is a little bit different at General Conference, and it is like running a marathon. But just trying to nibble at it a little bit at a time and do it immediately instead of waiting.
Sybil, let me ask you about, as part of a plan, you also have to plan for your media. Who will be your spokespersons? Do you have key messages that you want to share? Like Paul mentioned about having messages for the day. How far ahead do you plan? What do you do? Share some tips for us.
So while we do some advanced planning, some of the tips that I offer the delegation are in the moment when they hear from a reporter, to just ask a couple of questions, to ask who the reporter is with, what subject they're calling about or emailing about, and what their deadline is. And then we can develop a message appropriate to their deadline together, or it may be that the delegate is prepared to speak right then on the topic. But some of what I do is I think through scenarios in advance, but also recognize that we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. So some of it is foundational and just how to calmly respond, and we'll figure out what to say after.
How about you, Paul? Do you have some tips for?
Well, a lot of that goes back to when the inquiry comes in. When I have been designated the spokesperson, most of those come directly to me. And so at that point, if I need some guidance from the delegation, I talk with them so that we come up with whatever is prepared. If it's a specific person, I do a lot of coaching like Sybil talked about. And the other piece that a lot of folks don't realize is the communicators also is the intermediary with the media and the bishops. So we've got that whole piece too of amplifying the voice of our bishop when those calls come in where they want that. And General Conference, there's some real barriers in how much available time we have with our bishops too, that we have to juggle in the midst of that.
Rick, you were telling me about a process that you use to sort of make sure that you get perspectives from multiple delegates, and how your process works like during General Conference. Could you share that with us?
As far as the weekly plan, or?
How you send out a question for the
sure.
day?
So it's a matter of texting, sometimes emailing the delegation, and saying, either at the beginning of the day or at lunch, depending upon what's taken place during the course of the business session, trying to get an answer to one question, based upon what was decided this morning, or based upon what's on the, what was said this afternoon. What is your response to that? What is your reaction to that? What do you think that implication of that decision or those comments could be for the church, so that we can then share those. I do a delegate musings part of the website, so that we can hear from both clergy and lay delegates on the web and in real-time reaction.
And he doesn't get 100% response rate on that either.
Which is why you send it out to everybody, because if you pick one person or you pick two people, then you're controlling what the message is. If you give everybody on the delegation an opportunity to respond, then everybody's being treated equitably. And you're hopefully going to get some response from both clergy and from laity. There have been times when I've heard just from the laity and I haven't heard from clergy, so I'll reach out to the clergy and say, look, I've got reaction from our lay delegates, but I need reaction from clergy, and I need it by 4 o'clock, just because I think it's important that voices from everybody are heard throughout this process.
All right, I'm going to ask another question, but I just want to say, if you have a question, if you want to make your way to the microphone while I'm asking this question, I want to make sure we are able to get some from the audience if you have some. So what is your one big tip for success? Anybody?
I go back to having a plan, because if you don't go into General Conference with a plan, you can't react when things change. And you can't create a plan on the fly, because in 10 minutes that plan's going to change anyways, because the mood of the room has changed or a decision has been made that changes it. And all of a sudden you realize the General Conference has ended and you haven't really told a story. You've just sort of blown with the wind. And I think it's important to have a message or to have a plan going in, so then you can adapt and change accordingly.
I would say don't think you know everything, and therefore rely on the resources that are available to help you. Ask questions. Both of individuals are internal to your to the delegation, as well as to the Director of Communications.
I would say that go in with a plan, and also keep your eyes wide open for what is happening, for what will be important to the local church member back home, and what it means to them.
I would say, I would echo Rick in one way. I would call it planned spontaneity. If you've ever worked a lot of times, like at annual conference or whatever with media, there are those free spirits that kind of want to go with the flow to the point that they wreak havoc on your AV people. And, I understand the need for being able to respond to the Spirit. I just tell them that's fine, but God can work with a plan too.
I don't really know what success looks like from my perspective, because I'm not trying to tell a particular story, but I think for me, at the end of the day, if the people who are looking to me to find out what's going on, if they feel that there's a connection, if the people in my congregation feel like they know that their pastor is staying connected to them or desiring to have that open communication, then I feel like it's been successful.
If I can add in here, there's been a lot of conversation over the years about a way forward. I'd like to challenge each of us, communicators and delegates, that like to pay it forward. I went into General Conference in 2012 in Tampa, wide-eyed with no clue what I was doing. And I learned as I went, and I would not have been successful as I was without Victoria Rebeck, who was in Minnesota as the Director of Communications at the time. And I walked into the newsroom one day not knowing where to sit. I sat down, Victoria was next to me, and she walked me through the entire process of what I needed to know and what this decision that just made, what it means for me, and where I should go in the ADCA, and all of those different parts. So, every time I see Victoria, I thank her for that information, and I've tried to learn from that and tried to pay it forward for others. I still have a ways to go, but I encourage all of us, if you're a veteran delegate, take somebody who's new under your wing and sort of show them the way, and the same thing with communicators. And if we can all just work together, it's going to be a much better process, and we're all going to enjoy it along the way.
Let's go to our microphone here.
Hi there, Charmaine Robledo, she, her, hers, Director of Communications for the Mountain Sky Conference. I just want to know your thoughts about letting or partnering with delegates to be editors on your social media channels, or giving them direct access so they can quickly post and share.
Did anyone try that?
I haven't tried it, Charmaine. It's something to consider as I'm processing that as you asked the question. I think in one area it would be helpful to give quick access, but I'm also reluctant to give up control of what we use throughout the course of the year. There's processes in place for a reason, and I think that once you start making an exception in one area, you open up a door and create a scenario that could be hard to contain down the road. We want to trust that everybody is going to work to the good of the cause, but I'm really hesitant to open up that door.
I agree.
I would suggest creating a separate channel. Following the special session last year, I had 2 or 3 individuals that basically took over the conference group with just posts constantly, such to the point that we could not get anything else out. And so what I did, I went out and created a different page called Post General Conference 2019 Reflections. And we set the rule that anything dealing with General Conference at that point would be handled over here. And we got back the restoring of the channel to the point that it could be used for the purpose as the official channel of the conference.
So we have 1 minute left to have one question for one person. Does anyone have a lesson learned or something that you tried that didn't work? Anyone tried to do too much, perhaps were too ambitious in what you had planned to do?
I think we all try to do too much. I would think my one tip, my one suggestion would be reread before you post. Whether it's on social media, whether it's a press release, whether there's nothing worse than a retraction 5 minutes after you just issued something. So read and reread before you post. It's sort of the measure twice, cut once mentality.
All right. Well, I want to thank our audience for being so attentive, and especially over the last 2 days. We're the last panel, so thank you to all of you who stayed with us, and I want to thank my panel for sharing all their knowledge and experience.